In today's video, I want to talk about 5 tips to avoid injury at the piano. You don't have to be deeply involved in the Taubman approach or be studying it to utilize these tips to take away and ease discomfort, pain, while playing certain passages at the piano. The first one I'd like to talk about is twisting. If you look at the alignment of my fingers, hand, and arm, you can see that my wrist is fairly well lined up with my forearm as well as my hand. Twisting is what's caused when there is a break in the wrist in the lateral direction, meaning the left or right direction. This often happens when we have a unusual passage or combination of fingers, or if we're trying to get to a large interval without using the rotation. People often do it when playing an octave, so they'll reach for the octave with their 4 and 5, causing a twist on the right side of the wrist. This also happens in the other direction, where you can twist this way. So an easy way to check for that is look at the sides of your wrist when playing a passage, and you can tell to see if you're twisting. Usually a solution for this is using some rotation or a little bit of in and out. The next thing I want to talk about is curling. If you outstretch your hand, just leave it in a natural open position and wiggle your fingers, you can see that it's very free and easy to do. Once you start curling your fingers, they immediately become tense and you feel some tension. A very common place for curling to occur is when you're playing 1, 2, 3 on 3 white notes. What happens is we resist the urge to play within the black key area, and instead of moving our whole finger, hand, and arm apparatus out, what we do is we curl our fingers to play in the white key area. But using in and out, you can see that no curling occurs. The third thing to avoid injury at the piano, and this is very common, is what's known as stretching. Stretching is when you play an interval with 2 fingers that is too large for that interval, too large for your fingers to reach. So for example, something like a fifth between 2 and 5 is very common, or 2 and 4 rather. This is really stretched out and is very bad for your hands. It immediately causes tension and pain here. Other things that can cause tension is when a large chord is written and will stretch to play it. Now, usually you can tell when you're stretching because your fingers feel stretched out and it's uncomfortable, but sometimes we don't know how to avoid it. Now, sometimes you can edit a passage, maybe removing a note or breaking it up between 2 hands to avoid stretching. I always say that the chord is not worth it. This often happens in jazz piano when people try to play a stretched chord like that. Now, the 10th is fine, but sometimes people try to do that, and that is a huge stretch, 7th between 5 and 2. You can simply not play it, or you can change it, the voicing. The fourth tip to avoid injury at the piano is called collapsing. Now, collapsing occurs in 2 places. It can occur in either knuckle joint. So an example of, and the most common cause of collapsing is here. You'll see that this knuckle joint is above this knuckle joint. You'll see the difference between that and that. You can see how these knuckles are a little bit depressed. Now that happens because the weight of the arm isn't balanced over the finger. It's actually falling back, causing a break in the knuckle here. So you can kind of coach yourself to not collapse by just dropping down on one note and checking to see if you have a knuckle here. One way that I like to coach myself is to imagine a bone, one solid bone extending from the tip of my finger all the way back to my forearm. And if there's a break here, that bone would be broken. The other common place for collapsing to occur is in the wrist. Now, usually you want a flat wrist aligned with your hand and forearm. There's no break. It's not up like this. It's not down like that. And the collapse down is very common. What happens there is the weight of the arm is falling backwards. It's kind of like standing up on 2 feet. If you lean your weight backwards, eventually you'll fall over. The same thing happens at the piano. You need to be balanced over the fingertips in order to keep your wrist aligned with your finger's hand and arm. The fifth tip to avoiding injury is to try to prevent and avoid places where there's holding. And holding can apply to 2 contexts. The first is what I call holding up, meaning the full weight of the arm is not being released over the finger. If I play a note, it's hard for me to even do, but if I play a note and I don't feel the bottom of the key bed, I know that I'm holding up in some sense, meaning the full weight of my arm hasn't been released into the key. And it doesn't matter if you're playing quietly or loudly, you can still have a sense of being on the bottom of the key. And that doesn't mean to say that you're pressing on the bottom of the key. That can cause other problems. But it just means that the full weight of your forearm has been released and you feel balanced over the fingers. If you don't do that, there'll be some kind of holding up. It goes in either into your back, into your upper arm, into your neck, and it can cause a lot of pain. It also causes a kind of a weak tone. And the last instance in which holding can occur is when you have a passage where a note is written for, let's say, a half note, and then there's some other accompanying figure happening. A very common exercise that some pianists do is the Brahms, where a couple notes will be held down and then you try to isolate each finger and do that. I would highly recommend avoiding those exercises. Now, usually you can look at the passage and figure out a way to play it without holding. For example, if the melody is up here and then there's some accompanying figure here, I don't need to hold all of that. I don't need to hold my 5th finger to play all that. I can play it and release it and still play the inner voices. You have to look at it within context. Usually you can find a way to do it, but it's a very common instance of holding causing pain when it doesn't need to be held. After all, once you play a note, the hammer has struck the string. There's nothing you can do to affect the sound of that note any longer, so why hold on to it? I hope these tips are helpful. I'll be going over more in the future, but these 5 tips can really prevent a lot of pain at the piano. Hope you enjoy.